The Toronto Blue Jays have long been seen as the favorite to land Kyle Tucker in free agency, but now that they may be out of the market to sign him, the New York Mets could very well swoop in.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're going to talk about Kyle Tucker. In the first segment, I want to talk about how the Toronto Blue Jays may be out on Tucker after signing Kazuma Okamoto, and how that could open the door for the Mets to jump in and sign the top free agent on the board. In the second segment, we're going to talk about contract, what would be the structure the Mets would target to land Tucker. And then in the final segment, does it make sense for Kyle Tucker to be the Mets' top priority moving forward this offseason? Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've covered the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I am the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Before tip-off, check the FanDuel app and see what's dropping during the NBA happy hour every Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. All right, so Kyle Tucker and the Toronto Blue Jays has been a rumor that has been going on all offseason. At one point, Tucker visited the Blue Jays spring training facility in Dunedin, and everybody expected this to get done. I remember the beginning of the offseason, I made the prediction for Just Baseball that Kyle Tucker was going to sign with the Blue Jays for, I think, $430 million on a 10-year deal. And I remember thinking, oh, man, I'm the only one that's going to have Tucker to the Blue Jays. And then everybody connected those dots and thought Tucker was going to sign with Toronto. But now that they just picked up Kazuma Okamoto, a surprising signing, doesn't necessarily seem like they need Tucker anymore. I mean, obviously, you can always use a talent like Kyle Tucker, but let's just go through this Blue Jays lineup. Signing Okamoto moved Addison Barger from third base to right. You have Anthony Santander, you invested a lot of money in last offseason. You would expect them to try to play him this year, so he would be in left. You have Dalton Varsho in center. You have George Springer as your DH. Ernie Clement now moves from third a little bit to just maybe a full-time second baseman. Could be a utility guy if you re-sign Bo Bichette, which is another move the Blue Jays could make. You have Nathan Lukes and David Schneider off your bench. Joey Loperfido can't find any time on this team, and honestly, not a bad trade target for the Mets to get a guy in Loperfido that was once a top prospect who had a lot of success in a limited amount of playing time last year. On tomorrow's show, I'm going to touch on what I teased for today's show, which is underrated bats, and we're going to build out the 2026 Mets without making a big splash. So maybe I'll have Loperfido in that show tomorrow as we're looking at some more budget additions the Mets could make. But as we look at the Blue Jays, it doesn't seem like they're now in position to sign Kyle Tucker when they have so many mouths to feed when it comes to at bats that they have to spread out across this roster anyway. Ben Nicholson-Smith, who is plugged in on the Blue Jays, said that they're going to continue to check in on Bichette and Tucker, and if they fall to them at the right price, they might still sign one of them. But he sort of made it seem like they might be done with building out this offense. And again, rightfully so with all the talent that they have collected here. So if all of a sudden the Blue Jays are out, Ben Nicholson-Smith, he's saying the Mets should be the favorite to give Kyle Tucker a long-term deal. Now, his comment on the show that he was on about the Mets being the potential favorite, it doesn't seem like that was a reported statement. It was more him sort of connecting some dots, looking at the Mets Fangraphs roster resource page, seeing that all they have is Juan Soto and now Tyrone Taylor and Carson Bench slated to be their starting outfield, and just looking at the propensity to spend and saying, yeah, well, the Mets make a lot of sense, but they do make a lot of sense. And you have other New York-based reporters like Will Salmon who are saying similar things about the Mets as what Ben Nicholson-Smith said about the Blue Jays on Tucker, which is, oh, well, they're going to keep checking in. They're going to keep tabs on these guys. But it also has seemed like the Mets prefer Cody Bellinger, With that said, Cody Bellinger probably wants to go back to the Yankees, and there's been a lot of reporting over the past week here that the Yankees are making a push to get a deal done. They offered him a formal contract, and then there's a second offer that was reported to have been presented to Bellinger. So let's just say Cody Bellinger ends up signing with the Yankees this week, and Kyle Tucker is left on the board. Well, now who's going to sign Tucker? Because the Yankees obviously aren't. They don't seem to be in the market for him anyway. If the Blue Jays are no longer on the table, where does he land? Mark Feinstein did a story breaking down Kyle Tucker's market, and he listed the Yankees, the Mets, the Diamondbacks, the Giants, the Dodgers, and the Blue Jays as the teams that have been connected to Tucker this offseason. Well, if we cross off the Blue Jays, we cross off the Yankees, then you're left with Mets, D-backs, Giants, Dodgers. The Giants' payroll is already higher this year projected than it was last year, and they have a lot of money on their books. They got Rafael Devers now. They got Willie Adames. They got Matt Chapman. Jung-Hoo Lee's even starting to make $22 million per year on a backloaded contract. Willie Adames makes $13 million this year, but then that's going to jump up to $31 million over the next 5 years. It's 31 and change, a little bit more than that. Devers starts to make over $30 million per year. Chapman's making about $25 million per year. You even have Logan Webb, who's on a cheap deal relative to his contributions, but it's still $23 million over the next 2 years and $24 million in a third year. So when you look at a payroll that already has has 2 salaries that are over 30 million and would have 3 if you had Tucker, while still having Jung-Hoo Lee, Matt Chapman, and Logan Webb over 20, you start to wonder if the Giants really are going to be in the market for Kyle Tucker, even though he would be the perfect fit to complete that lineup. So now let's just say the Giants are out. Are we really going to buy into the Diamondbacks making that big splash and signing Kyle Tucker? Doesn't feel that likely when, typically when they've spent in the past, it's been on pitching. So if the Diamondbacks aren't in, and honestly, until I read that story from Mark Feinstein, I've never seen them connected to Kyle Tucker. Well, then all of a sudden, it comes down to Mets versus Dodgers in a potential bidding war for Kyle Tucker on a short-term deal. So we're going to talk about in the next segment is terms of contract. What would the Mets try to pursue if they were going to land Tucker? We're going to go through the options in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Fridays are always going to feel a little bit different during the basketball season, and FanDuel is going to make them even better because every Friday night before the games tip off, FanDuel is giving fans a new way to kick off the weekend slate with NBA Happy Hour. NBA Happy Hour is your official pregame, a limited time window where special offers drop right inside the FanDuel app before the action begins. Fridays start at 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern time for appointment viewing over at FanDuel with Happy Hour. Open up the FanDuel app, and during Happy Hour, you're going to see something new, whether it's boost bonuses or other surprises. It's easy to check the weekly special before tip-off and make a move before that window closes. The timing is perfect right before the games or right before the weekend starts. So before tip-off, check the FanDuel app and see what's dropping during NBA Happy Hour every Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. A little basketball, a little action, and a whole lot of Friday energy. That's NBA Happy Hour only on FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. All right, so contract. What would it take to sign Kyle Tucker? No longer feels like a $400 million deal is on the table for Tucker. Seems like at best he's getting $300 million. And if this comes down to Mets versus Dodgers, it could very well be a short-term battle where these teams are putting together their best offers on a 2 or a 3-year deal, which would allow Kyle Tucker to hit free agency again when he's going into his age 30 season. He's 28 now, will be 29 by opening day. So he still has one more season in his 20s. And if he hits free agency after a better year in 2026, he very well could still get that 10-year contract that spans $300+ million. And he could do so after collecting a very high AAV in the first year or the first 2 years of a potential deal, where maybe he gets 2 for 100, maybe he gets 3 for 120, or maybe it's 2 for 90. If it's a bidding war between the Mets and the Dodgers on a short-term deal, I think the only issue there is the Dodgers are just a much better situation for a 1 year, you know, push all the chips in on yourself, go out, bet on, putting together the best possible seasons you can hit the market again. If that's where you're angling, go to the Dodgers. You got a chance to play on the biggest stage, win a World Series. You don't have to be the best player on the team. You don't have to be the second, the third, or the fourth best player on there. Like, you are, when it comes to star power, so far down the pecking order, because you got Ohtani, you got Yamamoto, you got Mookie Betts, you got Freddie Freeman. So Kyle Tucker, even though production-wise, he very well can put together a season that's up there with any of those guys offensively, he doesn't have that pressure. So I think that is really the perfect place for Kyle Tucker to go, to just maximize his 2026 season, get a bunch of money, win a World Series ring, opt out, hit the market next year. That's tough for the Mets to compete with. Where on the other side of it, it's go join this team that has been publicly the laughing stock this offseason, doesn't have good PR surrounding it. You have to go and play in a bigger market in New York that you've never experienced before. You have to deal with the pressure of playing in New York on the Mets after the season they just had. Plus, you're effectively replacing Pete Alonso in the lineup, a guy that was beloved by this fan base, where every single month of the season, if Pete Alonso is tearing the cover off the ball in Baltimore, your stats are going to be compared to Pete the whole time. So there's just so much that goes with signing with the Mets on a short-term high AAV deal. I'm not saying it's impossible for that structure to work for the Mets, because we don't know how much the Dodgers will really push the chips in to get Kyle Tucker. But it does feel like if he ends up on a 2 or a 3 year deal with the opt-out structure, the Dodgers would probably jump in. And I just don't know if you can compete with them when it's such a enticing opportunity. Yes, you're joining the team that you're kind of hopping on the bandwagon, but it's a fun bandwagon to be part of. And in baseball, there's not as much sort of stain that's attached to joining the front runner, like you might find where Kevin Durant in the NBA goes to the Warriors and everyone kills him for the rest of his career. You're not going to get that if you're Kyle Tucker, and it's just a better situation. So I don't know if the short-term high AAV deal ultimately ends up coming to fruition for the Mets, just because I think the Dodgers would step up if that is what Tucker ends up seeking, and I feel like he might choose to go there. A longer term deal with a lower AAV doesn't feel like something that the Mets would necessarily entertain. It feels like for the Mets to go to a 10-year deal, they would have to be getting some type of a discount on that contract where it makes sense for them to invest that long term, when they've been sort of straying from long-term investments. To sign up for 10 years of Kyle Tucker, you got to think that after the first 5, he might not be a corner outfielder anymore, and neither could Juan Soto. And you don't have either of them right now as a guy that you can say, oh, they'll be a first baseman in 5 years. With Cody Bellinger, not that you'd even have to go beyond 5 or 6 years to sign him, but you do know that if he can't play the outfield anymore, he's got a home at first base. You still don't know that about Soto or Tucker, even if we think that Juan Soto eventually becomes a first baseman. That's not guaranteed yet. So it's tough to tie yourself to 10 years of Kyle Tucker when there is uncertainty about the back end. And also, here's a guy that has been hurt the last couple of years. I think they've been more fluky injuries. I don't think there's anything that you look at with the broken shin. And I think last year it was like a broken wrist or something like that. Let me see what Kyle Tucker's injury was last year. Or maybe, well, there was a quad at the end of the year, but I think there was a hairline fracture in his right hand in June that really slowed down his season, and then a calf strain in September. So, there's nothing there that makes you say, oh, these are like degenerative injuries that are really going to plague him. But again, I don't really envision the Mets handing out a 10-year contract to anybody, but even to Kyle Tucker. So to me, I almost feel like the way that this can get done for the Mets is if it's some sort of marriage in between where it's not a 10-year contract, it's not a 3-year contract. Maybe it's a 6-year deal where Kyle Tucker is going to get a high average annual value and he still gets an opportunity to opt out. But because you're willing to commit 6 years to him, that opt out's not after the first season, might not even be after the second season. Maybe that opt out comes halfway, into the deal. So the contract that I would propose that I think would make sense for the Mets, 6 years, $210 million for Kyle Tucker. So that's $35 million per season when it comes to the AAV and how that's going to factor into your luxury tax. I think you can further incentivize him by front loading that deal. So maybe you do decide, you know what? We want Kyle Tucker. We'll give him the 120 for the first 3 years or 110 for the first 3 years. And you front load it where the opt out is him opting out of, let's say, 3 years, 90 million. So the Mets have less risk on the back end. On the front end, they're obviously paying him more, but what the Mets care about more is the luxury tax. And for the luxury tax, it all gets smoothed out. So whatever he is guaranteed to make, you can then take that number, divide it over the 6 years, which 210 again divided by 6, you get 35 million per year. That's how that factors into your luxury tax. I think that's a contract that makes sense for the New York Mets, where again, you're guaranteed to have Kyle Tucker for 3 years. So you're getting his absolute prime, his age 29, 30, and 31 seasons. And then he gets a chance to opt out. And when he's hitting free agency at 31 years old, going into his age 32 season, maybe he can still get a 5 or 6 year deal. And if that's not enticing to him, maybe you put that opt out after the second year. I'd still be willing to do that on the same 6-year deal because you're getting age 29 and 30 of Kyle Tucker when you're trying to win now with Juan Soto, and then he could be off your books. So I think that's maybe what makes the most sense is if the Mets go a little bit further when it comes to the years they commit to Tucker. Tucker at least can rest easy knowing I already locked in a $200+ million contract. Yes, my agent told me we might get 400. That never happened, which is a letdown, but you secure a $200+ million deal. You give yourself the opportunity to still opt out and take another bite out of free agency a couple years down the line. And you get to go to a good team that does have a star player who's still going to take a lot of the attention away from you, Juan Soto. Francisco Lindor will do so as well. And you are all of a sudden part of what I think could be a very good lineup. And that's where we're going to close the show. What would the Mets look like with Kyle Tucker? And should this be the guy that they prioritize throughout the rest of this offseason? I'm going to go through that to close out the show in just a minute. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now take it up a level. Go ad-free. Join the Everyday Club today and get Locked On Mets with no interruptions, members-only Discord access, and more, all for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Go to lockedonmets.supercast.com or check the link in the show notes to learn more. All right, so let's look at what the Mets would have in their lineup if they sign Kyle Tucker. This is the best bat that they can add. Cut and dry, no other ways to look at it. There is not a better bat in free agency or on the trade market than Kyle Tucker. He's one of the best hitters in Major League Baseball. Since 2021, there are only 11 hitters in Major League Baseball who have a WRC plus over 140. Of course, WRC plus is weighted runs created plus. League average is 100. If you have a WRC plus over 140, you are an elite hitter. The group of hitters that have that WRC plus over 140 over the past 5 seasons, all stars or future Hall of Famers: Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, Yordan Alvarez, Juan Soto, Ronald Acuna Jr., Mike Trout, Freddie Freeman, Bryce Harper, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., Kyle Tucker at number 10, and then Corey Seager. Of all players over the past 5 years, When it comes to WAR, Kyle Tucker is 10th. So he's a top 10 overall player and a top 10 hitter in the game over the past 5 seasons, where he's hit 277 with a 386 on base, a 529 slug. So the OPS is over 900, which is very impressive. He's walked 10% of the time. He struck out 15% of the time. And last year, he only struck out one more time than he walked. So nearly identical strikeout and walk rates last season. To have Juan Soto and Kyle Tucker in your lineup in the first inning of a game, you are going to wear out the opposing pitcher. That is a great 1 through 3 in your lineup. If it's Lindor, Soto, Tucker, and Kyle Tucker is going to protect Juan Soto just as much as Pete Alonso did. Again, top 10 hitter in baseball over the last 5 years. Better than Pete Alonso overall. It's not the slugger that Pete is. Not going to hit as many home runs, might not drive in as many runs, but he is going to give you a better at-bat more consistently. And then beyond that in your lineup, you'd have Jorge Polanco at first or at DH with Mark Vientos at first or DH. You'd have Beatty, Alvarez, Marcus Semien, and Carson Bench. That is a really good starting lineup. If Bench isn't ready, then you'd have Tyrone Taylor. You'd have Acuna on your bench. You'd have Torrens on your bench. You could have Ronnie Mauricio off your bench, but it would still be a bench that probably would need one more addition. Ideally, a right-handed bat since Kyle Tucker is left-handed. And at that point, maybe you look at a lefty masher like an Austin Hayes or a Miguel Andujar to complete that lineup. To me, that's a really good team. And offensively, it's the best team the Mets could put together. I still think that there is some merit in Cody Bellinger just being a better positional fit for this team. The defense being so important to the Mets, I understand why they might prefer Bellinger because he is clearly an elite defensive corner outfielder. You look at Kyle Tucker, he was that in 2022. He was still a plus defender in 2024, but last year he wasn't great. And athletically, he is a step down from Bellinger. He's not as quick, doesn't have quite the same arm that Cody Bellinger does. And he doesn't have that ability to flex over and play first base. So I still think that Cody Bellinger is the better roster fit for the Mets, and he makes more sense based on what this team has been doing this offseason, which is improving defensively. But let's not make any mistake about it. Kyle Tucker is a better player than Cody Bellinger. Cody Bellinger is nowhere near a top 10 hitter in baseball. Kyle Tucker is. And this team still has a lot of offense that they're trying to make up after moving on from Alonso, McNeil, Nimmo, and picking up Marcus Semien, who has not been an above-average hitter the last couple of years. You hope for a bounce back, but you have to expect that his value is largely going to come from his defense at second base. And Polanco is not a sure thing to be a huge bat in your lineup. Had a great season, made some swing changes. It does seem like he can be a really good middle of the order bat for you, but you don't know for sure he's going to do that. Kyle Tucker is going to hit. And with where this team is at, I think he's the guy that the Mets could acquire this offseason at this point that I'd probably be the most excited about. I think the fans would be the most excited about. Short of maybe Jarren Duran, just because of the flash and the combination of really good defender who could play center field, extra base hitting machine, who also is under cheap team control. So probably the best contract situation for the Mets moving forward. Again, Jarren Duran is no Kyle Tucker. So we'll see what happens. It does seem like the market is kind of deteriorating around Kyle Tucker, and that might lead him to entertain some different things. And all of a sudden, if you can sign Kyle Tucker to a 6-year deal or a 7-year deal that is nowhere near as prohibitive as a 10-year deal, and you can maybe swoop in and get something done, I think you really have to consider it. Again, Bellinger still makes a lot of sense, but it seems like the Yankees' whole offseason right now is revolving around Cody Bellinger. And I don't know if the Mets are quite there. And because of that, would feel like it's more likely that Bellinger returns to the Yankees. And if he does, well, now where are you going to turn if you're the Mets? And if it's not Kyle Tucker, Well, then it could be Austin Hayes and a Joey Loperfido platoon in left field, which is what we get to talk about on tomorrow's show. I teased it yesterday. I was going to talk about underrated bats in the market. I could honestly only come up with a couple that I still like in this free agent class. It is that thin at this point. So what we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to get creative. We're going to do some trades. We're going to do some free agent signings, and we're going to find a way to build out the Mets roster without making a single big splash. So no Framber Valdez signing, no Freddie Peralta trade, no signing of Tucker or Bellinger or trading for Jared Duran. We're looking at Austin Hayes. We're looking at Miguel Andujar. We're looking at Joey Loperfido and Lars Nootbaar, and we're trying to find the perfect combination to complete this Mets lineup and to complete this rotation to build out a team that could still contend next year while not being anywhere near as sexy as some of the additions could be that we've talked about throughout the offseason and that we talked about today with the potential Kyle Tucker signing. As always, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network.